Canada has just executed a historic economic maneuver that is fundamentally breaking its long-standing structural dependence on the United States. During a high-stakes address to the Canadian Parliament, Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled a new national strategy centered on a single deliberate term, a pirouette. Borrowed from the world of ballet, this term describes a maneuver where a dancer performs a controlled, elegant rotation on one leg, shifting direction while maintaining perfect balance. By using this specific imagery, Carney signaled to the world that Canada is not haphazardly reacting to external pressure, but is instead executing a precise, pre-planned change in course that uses the momentum of current events to pivot toward a new economic reality. This pivot is the culmination of 18 months of quiet, intense preparation. For decades, Canada's economic path was considered tethered to Washington, a byproduct of shared borders, deeply integrated supply chains, and a massive, one-sided trade volume. However, the Canadian government treated this deep integration not as a permanent physical fact, but as a strategic choice that had become increasingly irrational under current diplomatic and trade conditions. The pirouette represents the realization that the old model of relying almost exclusively on American markets is no longer sustainable. Instead of panicked flailing or impulsive retaliatory measures, Canada has deployed a disciplined, multi-sector strategy designed to leverage its own resources to build genuine economic independence. The brilliance of this maneuver lies in how it turns the environment to Canada's advantage. Instead of fighting the force of American political pressure, the Canadian strategy utilizes that very momentum to fuel the rotation. By identifying points of strength within its own domestic economy, such as energy, commodities, and financial services, Canada has locked in its pivot, ensuring that as it turns away from the American market, it does not lose its stability or momentum. This movement is designed to leave Canada landing in a completely different direction, no longer tethered to the whims or policy volatility of its neighbor to the south. Ultimately, this is a calculated declaration of maturity. It signals that Canada is transitioning from a subordinate economic partner into an autonomous player on the global stage. The decision was not made in a vacuum. It was born from a long-term assessment of risk and the necessity of building a more secure, diversified future. By framing this shift as a pirouette, Carney communicates that the government has the focus, the technical skill, and the strategic foresight to change its path without stumbling. It is a fundamental decoupling that aims to protect Canada's national interest, ensuring that the country's economic future is decided by its own leaders in Ottawa rather than by the unpredictable pressures of Washington. The historical weight of the pirouette is profound because it links Canada's modern strategy directly to the most significant era of Canadian geopolitical redefinition in the 20th century. To understand why this matters, you have to look at the vision of Pierre Trudeau, the 15th Prime Minister, who famously defined Canada's existence by its proximity to the United States. He described the relationship as sleeping next to an elephant. No matter how friendly or gentle that elephant might be, every twitch, grunt, or shift in weight creates a tremor that impacts the smaller neighbor. For decades, Canada felt this dynamic as an inescapable reality, where American economic policies, whether positive or disruptive, dictated the heartbeat of the Canadian market. To counter this inevitable instability, Trudeau introduced what he called the third option. The first two options were essentially to continue the status quo or to integrate even more deeply with the United States. The third option, however, was a radical departure. It involved the deliberate, long-term effort to diversify Canada's trade relationships globally. The goal was to build a network of partners across Europe, Asia, and beyond, to ensure that Canada's economic survival was not tied to the moods of a single superpower. When Trudeau successfully executed a series of diplomatic pivots away from American pressure toward European engagement in the 1970s, observers labeled the movement a pirouette. By choosing this specific term again today, Mark Carney is doing something much more powerful than just making a policy announcement. He is anchoring his entire modern economic agenda in the legitimacy of a proven, celebrated Canadian political tradition. When he invokes the pirouette, he is sending two distinct messages. To the Canadian public, he is signaling that this move is not an act of desperation or a dangerous gamble, but a logical continuation of a time-tested strategy that has historical precedent and intellectual grounding. He is effectively saying that if Trudeau could successfully use balance and technique to maneuver around American dominance in the 70s, this government can do it again today. Furthermore, the term serves as a sharp signal to the international community. It frames Canada's current pivot as a demonstration of disciplined strategy rather than reactive panic. It tells global markets and foreign capitals that Canada is not being dragged into this position by crisis. Instead, it is choosing its own direction through calculated, graceful, and controlled rotation. It serves as a reminder to Washington that Canada has successfully navigated these waters before and that the country possesses the unique national character and diplomatic experience to maintain its balance even while shifting its entire economic weight. By framing the current situation as a tradition, Carney is telling the world that Canada is not just changing its trade partners, it is reclaiming its capacity to act independently, regardless of the elephant shifting next to it. The execution of this plan spans three critical sectors, but the most aggressive and immediate shift is the total reorientation of Canada's trade flows. For generations, Canada functioned as an economic partner, so deeply integrated with the United States that its reliance was treated as an unchangeable law of nature. Currently, approximately 75% of all Canadian exports are destined for the American market. This concentration means that every policy change or tariff enacted in Washington ripples instantly through every corner of the Canadian economy. Prime Minister Mark Carney has declared this status quo to be a relic of the past, setting a bold, non-negotiable target to reduce that dependency from 75% down to 50% within a 5-year window. This is not a modest, step-by-step adjustment. It is a rapid, wartime speed restructuring of the nation's entire economic geography. To achieve this, the Canadian government is actively severing the inertia of its singular focus on the US and aggressively redirecting those trade flows toward new global partners. This involves building formal, binding frameworks with major powers in India and China, as well as establishing strategic trade corridors with Gulf states and the broader BRICS Plus Energy Task Force. By proactively seeking out these new markets, Canada is forcing its supply chains to find destinations outside of North America, creating a diversified safety net that the country has lacked for decades. The infrastructure behind this pivot is as significant as the policy itself. The government has launched major, multi-billion-dollar initiatives, such as the Trade Diversification Corridors Fund, specifically designed to eliminate the logistical bottlenecks that previously made it easier to trade with the US than with the rest of the world. By investing in its own ports, rail systems, and pipelines, Canada is physically equipping itself to bypass the American market and reach buyers in Europe and Asia directly. This ensures that when Canadian companies look for new customers, the physical path for their goods is open, reliable, and cost-effective. Ultimately, this sector-wide reorientation is a fundamental change in how Canada views its role in the global economy. By moving away from a singular reliance on a neighbor that is increasingly unpredictable, Canada is asserting its own economic agency. It is a transition from a branch plant mentality, where Canada served as a supplementary factory for US demand, to a model of managed, strategic independence. By systematically lowering its exposure to Washington, Canada is ensuring that its future prosperity is not tied to the political volatility of one nation, but is instead spread across a resilient, global network of diversified trade partnerships. The second, and perhaps most technically significant, pillar of Canada's strategy involves the systemic dismantling of its reliance on American financial infrastructure. For decades, the global financial system has operated on the assumption that the US dollar is the unavoidable middleman for almost all international trade, a system controlled by American banking and clearinghouse protocols. Canada is now systematically pulling its entire national economy out of this arrangement. Effective immediately, the Canadian government has mandated that all procurement contracts with foreign suppliers must be settled either in Canadian dollars or the local currency of the partner nation. This means that if Canada buys goods from a provider in India, Brazil, or the Gulf states, the payment will bypass US clearing systems entirely. By removing the American dollar as the mandatory bridge, Canada has stripped away the ability of US institutions to monitor, control, or potentially obstruct its international transactions. To make this transition both permanent and practical, the Bank of Canada has taken a massive, unprecedented step by expanding its bilateral currency swap lines to a total of $680 billion for global partners. A currency swap line is essentially a pre-arranged credit facility between central banks, allowing them to trade their currencies for one another on demand without having to go through a third-party currency market. By offering this $680 billion in non-dollar liquidity, Canada is effectively creating its own self-contained financial ecosystem. This isn't just an aspiration or a future goal, it is a fully funded operational mechanism that is available to Canada's new trade partners right now. It ensures that businesses and governments working with Canada do not need to worry about being unable to access capital or settle debts, simply because they are not using the US dollar. This move fundamentally alters the power dynamic of international trade. By providing this massive volume of non-dollar liquidity, Canada has proven that it has the sovereign balance sheet and the political will to provide an alternative to the US-centric system. It signals to every central bank and finance ministry in the world that Canada is no longer tethered to the American financial architecture. For these global partners, the incentive is clear. They can now conduct large-scale trade with one of the world's most stable economies without exposure to US financial risks or potential American regulatory interference. By delinking its procurement and settlement processes from American infrastructure, Canada is ensuring that its economic pivot is protected by its own financial independence. It is an acknowledgement that in the modern global economy, trade flows are only as secure as the payment systems that facilitate them. By building its own, Canada has ensured that no external party can force a disruption in its supply chains or trade relationships through financial coercion. This is a deliberate structural move designed to insulate the Canadian state from the risks of being inside a system that it no longer feels is serving its best interests, replacing dependency with a direct, sovereign, and fully independent financial network. The third dimension of this strategy is energy sovereignty, which represents perhaps the most strategic point of leverage in the entire Canadian pivot. The government has established a dedicated agency, the Canadian Energy Diversification Authority, with a clear and ambitious mandate: negotiate long-term supply agreements with buyers across Europe and Asia. The goal is to aggressively reduce the American share of Canadian energy exports from the current 85% to 60% within the next 7 years. By actively moving Canadian energy away from a single dominant market, the country is transforming itself from a captive supplier into a globally oriented energy power. This move creates a powerful reverse leverage dynamic that is already causing concern in Washington. The reason this works so effectively is rooted in physical engineering. American Midwest refineries have spent decades specifically building and optimizing their equipment to process heavy crude oil imported from Canada. This is not a simple setup. Heavy crude is thick and requires complex, expensive, specialized machinery to break down into high-value products like gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. If these refineries were to suddenly lose their Canadian supply, they could not simply switch to domestic US light crude, which is thin and flows freely, to switch to light oil. These Midwest refineries would require massive, multi-billion-dollar capital investments and years of construction to reconfigure their facilities. This reality gives Canada a profound strategic advantage. By successfully diversifying its customer base to include Asian and European buyers, Canada is no longer begging the US to buy its oil. It is creating a scenario where American refiners are physically dependent on the Canadian supply that remains available. In effect, Canada is reversing the dependency relationship that defined the last 30 years. By creating alternative pathways for its energy products, Canada ensures that it is not forced to accept whatever terms or prices Washington dictates. This pivot forces American political leaders to confront a harsh economic reality. If they aggressively alienate Canada, they are not just attacking a foreign neighbor, they are potentially triggering a self-inflicted energy crisis in their own electoral heartland. By securing these new global contracts, Canada is effectively ensuring that its energy wealth becomes a source of national strength rather than a point of vulnerability. The initial reaction from Washington was entirely predictable, characterized by immediate and intense outbursts, yet it ultimately proved to be politically and economically toothless. President Trump responded to the Canadian announcement by flooding social media with a barrage of posts within a single 3-hour window. These messages were aggressive, framing Canada's policy shift as an act of economic betrayal and threatening to impose the most severe tariffs in American history. The rhetoric invoked national security powers and painted a picture of a looming trade war, attempting to exert the same pressure that had worked for decades. However, this eruption of political noise quickly hit a hard, immovable wall of reality when the president's own economic advisors were forced to confront the actual math behind these threats. The fundamental problem for the White House is that the leverage, which once belonged to the United States, has now effectively shifted to Ottawa. When the advisors crunched the numbers, they realized that any serious retaliation against Canada would inevitably backfire, causing more damage to the American economy than it would to the Canadian one. The energy sector serves as the most immediate example. If the United States were to force a trade conflict, Canada could simply divert a larger portion of its heavy crude oil toward Asian or European markets. Because Midwest U.S. refineries are specifically engineered to process Canadian heavy crude, a reduction in supply would immediately cause a spike in gasoline prices across the American heartland. This creates a disastrous political problem. The states most dependent on that specific Canadian oil, such as Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Minnesota, are precisely the swing states that decide American presidential elections. Increasing fuel costs for the voters in these specific regions is a political non-starter that would alienate the very electoral coalition the White House depends on for its survival. The White House political machine realized that threatening Canada with energy-related tariffs is in effect threatening to raise the price of gas for their own core voters. Once that realization set in, the threat stalled. The economic arithmetic simply could not support the aggressive escalation that the administration initially wanted to pursue. The agricultural sector creates a similar and equally devastating trap. Canada currently imports roughly $40 billion worth of American agricultural goods every year. If the United States initiates a trade war, Canada has the infrastructure to instantly redirect its food procurement toward partners in the GM-PEC or other global trade blocs. If Canada stops buying American grain, pork, and dairy, those farmers have nowhere else to send their products on such a massive scale. The American Farm Bureau and senators representing agricultural states are well aware of this risk. They recognize that if the administration pushes Canada to the point of breaking these trade ties, the result would be a direct assault on the rural, agricultural-dependent voting bloc that forms the foundation of the current administration's electoral power. Consequently, the administration is trapped. They cannot act without inflicting self-harm, leaving them with all of the threats and none of the leverage. The global business and investment community has taken swift notice of Canada's maneuver, treating it as a defining moment in modern economic history. The most resounding validation came from legendary investor Warren Buffett, who publicly praised Prime Minister Carney's decisive clarity. In the high-stakes world of international finance, Buffett is rarely quick to endorse specific political actions, but his support was both explicit and transformative. He underscored his confidence by confirming that Berkshire Hathaway has made Canada its largest international concentration of investment outside of the United States. For global markets, this was the ultimate signal that Canada is not merely making a temporary political statement, but is instead fundamentally re-anchoring its economy as a stable, attractive, and long-term prospect for global capital. The markets reacted to this decisive clarity with an immediate and decisive shift. The Canadian dollar surged 3.1% in a single session, marking its strongest performance in years, while the Toronto Stock Exchange rocketed to an all-time high. This movement was not the product of speculation. It was a clear verdict from the professional investment class that Canada had successfully reduced its risk profile by diversifying its economic foundations. Simultaneously, U.S. market indices that were heavily exposed to dollar-dependent trade entities experienced a sharp decline, reflecting investor fear that the era of captive, predictable trade with Canada was effectively over. This shift is a landmark demonstration of what is possible for a G7 democracy when it combines capable, long-term leadership with genuine political will. Canada has effectively proven that even a nation with deep, decades-long structural dependence on its neighbor can, through disciplined strategy, transition to a manageable and independent bilateral relationship. This process, which many analysts previously believed would take a decade or more to achieve, was executed in less than 2 years. It shows the world that geopolitical and economic facts are not set in stone. They are historical arrangements that change the moment the underlying conditions are shifted by a government willing to act. The pirouette is now complete, and Canada has successfully landed in a new, more secure position. It is no longer a passive participant in a trade relationship defined by the whims of others. It is now an active player defining its own economic future. This change is already rippling through the global landscape, as other finance ministries, central banks, and heads of government are forced to rethink their own models of dependency. Canada has set a new precedent for strategic autonomy, showing that with the right combination of structural reform and decisive communication, a middle power can move away from a dominant sphere of influence and onto a new independent trajectory that fundamentally alters how the world does business.